In June of 2001, Nas wasn't a legend. To the music industry, he was finished. Not struggling, not misunderstood, not rebuilding. Finished. On a massive screen at Summer Jam, a face flashed like a punchline while his rival laughed. Tens of thousands of people cheered. The radio replayed it, magazines summarized it, executives nodded quietly, and in real time, a decision was being made. And this isn't a story about rap beef. This is a story about how close Nas came to being erased. Not culturally, but commercially. About how fast legacy disappears when momentum dies. And about the night the industry nearly closed the book for good. Summer Jam 2001 wasn't a concert, it was a verdict. Summer Jam wasn't just another show, it was a judgment call. When Jay-Z stood on that stage and mocked the opposing camp, it wasn't framed as competition. It was framed as closure. No suspense, no tension, no anticipation of response. The message was clear. This battle is already over. And here's the detail history often glosses over. The image on that giant screen was not Nas. It was Prodigy of Mobb Deep, but nobody misunderstood the meaning. Prodigy wasn't the target, he was the warning. In hip-hop, you don't always attack the king directly. Sometimes you humiliate the soldier to show the kingdom is next. Why that image was so dangerous. Prodigy represented street credibility, lyrical threat, Queensbridge pride. So when his image became a joke in front of the city, the message went deeper than a diss record. Your entire side is exposed. And the crowd didn't resist. They laughed. That's when moments stop being cultural and start becoming institutional. Because laughter is permission. The night was bigger than hip-hop. This part matters. That night wasn't just watched by New York. Michael Jackson was in the building. When he appeared, the crowd didn't just cheer, they erupted. Because when Michael Jackson shows up, the room becomes global. Media, executives, out-of-town press. Suddenly, this wasn't just hip-hop talking to itself. The world was watching, which meant everything that happened on that stage carried farther, louder, and longer than usual. So when Jay-Z mocked Nas's camp that night, it didn't just live in the culture. It echoed outside of it. And humiliation at that scale hardens fast. The quiet story behind the screen, alleged. Years later, whispers began circulating that the image didn't just appear, that it was passed along, allegedly through Murder, Inc. connected circles, allegedly through Ashanti, who was closely associated with Irv Gotti at the time, and allegedly through old industry overlaps that went back years. Dance classes, shared spaces, familiar hands, even stories involving Prodigy's grandmother and the theater ownership would surface later. None of it was ever officially confirmed. None of it had to be, because perception moves faster than proof. And the perception was this. This wasn't accidental. This was coordinated. The lesson Nas learned as a teenager. While all of this played out, Nas wasn't just reacting to Jay-Z, he was remembering history. When Nas was coming up in Queensbridge, he watched another Queens artist get publicly dismantled, MC Shan. Shan wasn't alone. He was part of the Juice Crew. And when KRS-One went at him, it wasn't just a battle, it was a demolition, not just of a rapper, of a borough. And the Juice Crew didn't respond together. They didn't protect their own. They went quiet. Then came the line that stuck with Nas forever. Manhattan, keep on making it. Brooklyn, keep on taking it. Queens, keep on faking it. That wasn't just clever, it was humiliating. And silence turned it into truth. Nas learned something early. When you let public embarrassment sit, history doesn't wait, it decides. Why this moment forced Nas' hand. So when Jay-Z didn't come directly at Nas, but instead snuck Prodigy and Mobb Deep onto that screen, Nas recognized the play immediately. Same strategy, same setup, same trap, attack the soldier, embarrass the borough, wait for silence, let the narrative harden. Nas had already seen how that story ends, and he wasn't going to let Queensbridge become the Juice Crew all over again. The pressure nobody saw. While the industry watched the scoreboard, Nas was dealing with something else entirely. His mother was battling cancer. He wasn't absent because he had no response. He was absent because life had shifted his priorities. He would later reveal this in God's Son. But the industry doesn't pause for context. They only read momentum. Silence isn't interpreted as humanity. It's interpreted as weakness, the word that ends careers. By mid-2001, one word followed Nas everywhere, quietly, washed, not shouted, whispered in meetings, in radio offices, in marketing discussions, because the industry doesn't cancel artists loudly. It just stops calling, it stops pushing, stops believing, it stops risking money. That's how careers end. Jay-Z's advantage wasn't just music. Jay-Z didn't just have hot records. He had control of radio, control of media cycles, control of timing, and momentum creates reality. The industry didn't need Nas to lose lyrically. They just needed him to stall. Every month without a response widened the gap. Every interview without a counter hardened the story. Silence stopped being maturity. It became surrender. Stillmatic wasn't an album. It was an audit. Stillmatic wasn't a rollout. It was a final evaluation of relevance, of leverage, of market trust. If it failed, Nas wouldn't get another rebuild. He'd become a respected legacy act, a history lesson, a remember when name, still honored, but no longer central. Fans don't see that line. Executives do. The industry's silent question. Nobody asked Nas this directly, but everyone was thinking it. Does he still scare anyone? Not historically, not lyrically, right now? Because fear is currency in hip-hop, and fear had shifted rooms. Nas wasn't deciding whether to diss Jay-Z. He was deciding whether to gamble his entire career on one move, one record, one tone, one message, because if he missed, there would be no debate, no rematch, no revisionist history, just silence. And once silence arrives, the industry never looks back. What people remember is the explosion. What they forget is the quiet. Nas didn't rush to the radio. He didn't leak snippets. He didn't preview intentions. He disappeared, not because he was scared, but because he understood something critical. If the response sounded calculated, it would fail. This wasn't a chess move anymore. This was an intervention. By late 2001, the margin for error was gone. A clever diss would sound lightweight. A technical showcase would sound detached. A radio-friendly jab would sound afraid. Nas didn't need to out-rap Jay-Z. He needed to reframe reality, because the public wasn't waiting for bars. They were waiting for certainty. While the noise stayed outside, Nas went inward, not to chase hooks, not to chase charts, to confront the moment. This wasn't about who slept with whom or who sold more records. This was about authority. Who gets believed? Who gets feared? Who still commands attention when they speak? Nas knew the response had to feel ancient and immediate at the same time, like a ritual. When ether landed, it didn't sound modern. It sounded final. No glossy production, no radio polish, just a cold looping beat that felt like a warning siren. Nas didn't introduce himself, he indicted. The record didn't invite debate, it declared dominance, and that's why it worked. Ether didn't ask listeners to pick sides, it told them where the power was. The cadence wasn't playful, the delivery wasn't exciting, it was calm, and calm in moments of chaos reads as control. Nas wasn't yelling, he was sentencing. People love to quote bars, but Ether didn't win because of clever insults. It won because of the tone. Nas didn't sound like someone reacting. He sounded like someone correcting the record. That distinction matters. Reaction feels temporary. Correction feels permanent. The shift was immediate. Radio didn't just play Ether. They paused. DJs replayed it, hosts analyzed it, phones lit up. The conversation changed in hours. Not is Nas done, but how did this happen? Momentum doesn't die slowly. it breaks. Jay-Z lost control of the loop. For the first time in months, the feedback loop collapsed. Radio didn't know how to frame it. The media didn't know how to soften it, because ether didn't leave room for spin. It didn't escalate. It concluded. And when a record sounds like a conclusion, people accept it as one. Then came One Mic. This is where Nas separated himself completely. If ether was rage controlled, One Mic was pressure restrained. The song wasn't about Jay-Z, it was about containment. How much force can you hold without exploding? Nas didn't shout, he tightened, and that showed range. Anyone can yell when cornered. Few can whisper and still command attention. One Mic proved ether wasn't desperation. It was capacity. Nas wasn't empty. He was loaded. That scared the industry more than insults ever could. Here's the part that never gets announced. Executives don't apologize. They pivot. Suddenly, Stillmatic wasn't a risk anymore. It was a redemption narrative. Budgets adjusted, conversation shifted, confidence returned, not because Nas begged for it, but because he forced belief back into the room. After Summer Jam, nothing slowed down and it accelerated. What looked like a single moment on stage triggered a chain reaction behind the scenes. Phones started ringing, not with opportunities, but with questions. Not when's the response, but is there one? And in the music business, that distinction matters. Because once uncertainty replaces confidence, leverage disappears. The label reality nobody likes to admit. At this point, Nas wasn't just fighting for pride, he was fighting for position. Albums are investments, artists are portfolios. And when an artist's narrative turns unstable, labels don't panic, they reassess quietly. Stillmatic wasn't being treated as a creative project anymore. It was being treated as a risk exposure. If this album didn't reassert Nas's relevance quickly and decisively, the long-term plan would change. Not publicly, structurally. Smaller budgets, lower expectations, less promotional urgency. That's how the industry phases you out without ever saying your name. Momentum is a weapon. This is where Jay-Z had the advantage. Not just musically, systemically, he had momentum, and momentum controls perception. Radio spins reinforce press coverage reinforces public opinion reinforces executive confidence. It's a loop, and once you're inside that loop, you don't have to win every battle. You just have to keep moving. The waiting game becomes dangerous. Nas didn't respond immediately. Part of that was personal. His mother's illness hadn't stopped being real just because the industry was impatient. But the business doesn't pause for humanity. Silence started being interpreted as hesitation. Hesitation became doubt. Doubt became narrative, and the narrative was brutal. Maybe Nas doesn't want this anymore. That's poison in a competitive genre. The industry starts choosing sides. Here's the part fans rarely see. When a high-profile battle unfolds, the industry doesn't stay neutral. Radio chooses what to spin. The media chooses what to amplify. Promoters choose who feels current. And by late summer 2001, the choices were leaning in one direction. Not because anyone hated Nas, but because they didn't want to bet against momentum. Then came Super Ugly. This was the moment everything almost snapped. Super Ugly wasn't just a diss. It was a line crossing escalation. Jay-Z didn't aim for lyrical superiority. He aimed for personal damage, family, relationships, private territory. And the response wasn't just cultural, it was institutional. The radio shockwave. The record hit the radio and immediately changed the temperature. Stations didn't just play it, they reacted to it. Call-in lines lit up. DJs debated it on air, executives listened closely, because this wasn't a competition anymore. It was a liability, and labels don't like liability. Even Jay-Z would later admit this moment went too far. His own mother reportedly called him furious. That matters, because when your inner circle steps in, it means the line wasn't imaginary. The industry felt it too. This wasn't dominance. This was recklessness, and recklessness creates openings. Here's the paradox. Super Ugly didn't finish Nas. It forced him. It removed the option of silence, because silence now looked like acceptance. Nas no longer had the luxury of patience or subtlety. Whatever came next had to be immediate. overwhelming, undeniable. There was no room left for nuance. The pressure inside the camp, inside Nas' circle, the stakes were clear. This wasn't about responding, it was about surviving the cycle. If the response is missed, the narrative would finalize. Jay-Z crossed the line. Nas didn't answer. The public moved on. That's how legacies get frozen. The historical weight returns. Nas remembered the lesson again. MC Shan, the Juice Crew, silence after humiliation. History doesn't forgive delay, it rewards interruption. And if Nas waited too long, the outcome wouldn't be debated, it would be archived. By now, the window wasn't measured in weeks, it was measured in moments. Radio cycles move fast, public attention moves faster. Nas didn't need to win a back and forth. He needed to break the loop, to stop momentum cold. Why the response couldn't be strategic, it had to be spiritual. This is the key pivot. A clever diss wouldn't work. A polished radio record wouldn't work. A measured rebuttal wouldn't work. The response had to feel inevitable. It had been waiting to be released because the public doesn't respond to strategy in moments like this. They respond to conviction, the final calculation. Nas understood something critical. If he missed this shot, there wouldn't be another one. Not because he lacked talent, but because the industry would stop creating space for him. That's how pressure really works. It doesn't crush you loudly, it squeezes you until there's nowhere left to stand. Nas wasn't preparing a song, he was preparing a statement. Not to Jay-Z, to the industry, to the radio, to history, because whatever came next wouldn't just answer Super Ugly, it would decide whether Stillmatic mattered at all. And then the response landed. Not with an explanation, not with diplomacy, but with a war chant. This is the silent victory. Fear returned, not because Nas embarrassed someone, but because he reminded everyone he can still stop momentum. And anyone who can do that is dangerous. Ether didn't just answer Jay-Z, it interrupted a system. It broke a loop the industry thought was locked. That's why it still gets referenced, not as a song, but for a moment, the line between survival and legacy. At this point, Nas had survived, but survival isn't the same as dominance. The question shifted again. Can he hold this, or was this a one-time disruption? That answer wouldn't come from a diss. It would come from time. Nas had stopped the bleeding, but the war wasn't technically over. He had reclaimed space, but space has to be occupied. Because in hip-hop, silence after victory is just another opening. And that brings us to the final phase. Not the battle, but the consequence.